Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome. So firstly, I just want to say thank you to the Islamic Society, the president in particular, for facilitating this. It's supposed to be a debate, but it's no longer a debate. It's actually going to be a talk because he thought this wasn't happening. So one of the purposes of actually giving this talk, despite him not being here, is to show that actually this is a real place, it's a real university, and to thank, obviously, the Islamic Society, and also to thank the Student Union, the society's liaison officer. What was the name? Coordinator, right? So to thank them as well. So this is going to be a talk instead, and it's going to be a talk on, is Darwinian evolution a fact? Now, when it comes to the question of what is a fact, it can be defined in many different ways. Now, the way that Richard Dawkins talks about fact in his book, A Devil's Chaplain, he defines it in this particular book as the sun being stationary and the earth going around the sun. So, we used to have this idea of, in the past, the sun going around the earth, but no, we know that the earth goes around the sun. So this is a fact. This is something which doesn't change. This is something immutable. This is something unassailable. So this is a brute fact. Fact can also be defined as a general theory that's accepted by everybody. A fact can also be defined as something that has a consensus. We're not talking about that. We are talking about a fact as in something that is concrete, something that's absolute. And from that perspective, Darwinian evolution is not a fact. Now, he says something interesting in his book. He says, Darwin may be triumphant at the end of the 20th century, but we must acknowledge the possibility that new facts may come to light which will force our successors of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism or modify it beyond recognition. So the point is that he has recognized the problem of induction. He has recognized that actually there is always a possibility of the black swan. There is always the possibility that new facts may come to light which will challenge Darwinism. And he actually acknowledges it quite clearly and lucidly in his book. So is Darwinian evolution a fact from the definition of a fact being the earth going around the sun? No, not even according to him. And I also want to just be clear here. He's using the word Darwinism, okay? This is really important. He's using the word Darwinism because what we are often told is Darwinism doesn't exist. There's no such thing as Darwinism. It's just evolution. But the problem with that is evolution is observable, Darwinism is not observable. Darwinism is actually a much broader idea. And we're not just talking about, is it true that randomness exists? That's true. Is it true that natural selection can choose amongst variants? Is that background Darwinian process observable? Yeah, that is. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the broader idea that the whole of life, the adaptations that we have, the traits that we have, the abilities that we have, all of this can be explained from a Darwinian perspective. We're not talking about, just the background process and working on these small scales. That's irrelevant, and that's not really what we are interested in. Now, often we hear the terms Darwinism, neo-Darwinism, modern synthesis, and it gets a bit confusing. So I'm going to put to bed these confusions and define things very clearly. When I'm speaking about Darwinism, I am defining Darwinism the way Richard Dawkins does, which means the modern synthesis. Now, the modern synthesis is something which came about in the last century. And prior to this, it was known as neo-Darwinism. There's a little bit of history we need to go over because unless we define our terms, it can get very confusing. So why are we speaking about Darwinism? Why are we speaking about neo-Darwinism? Why are we speaking about modern synthesis? The reason is simple. It is the foundation of evolutionary theory today. It's the prevailing paradigm, it's the prevailing model, it's the prevailing view. There's no doubt about that. So that is the prevailing view. The modern synthesis, or neo-Darwinism, which arose out of the reconciliation of Darwin's theory of natural selection and Mendel's research on genetics, remains the foundation of evolutionary theory. Now, this is from a paper in 2021 by Hancock and others. So it's clear, this is clear, there's no doubt that it is the dominant idea. And you see here, they are referring to modern synthesis and neo-Darwinism in an interchangeable way. We have another paper here by Dennis Noble and Shapiro, James Shapiro, and they say the common belief that the neo-Darwinian modern synthesis was buttressed by the discoveries of molecular biology is incorrect. So here again, they're using the terms, but they're using the terms together. They're saying neo-Darwinian modern synthesis. So just to be clear, neo-Darwinism literally means post-Darwin. What happened after Darwin, okay? The modern synthesis was a reconciliation which happened in the early part of the 20th century, and neo-Darwinism developed into the modern synthesis, which is why it's still called neo-Darwinism. So it's like an upgrade. It's like neo-Darwinism 2.0. Now, I wanted Farina to be here, and a lot of us, we recognize the reasons that he's not here. Him not being here and him not being able to defend himself and him not being able to articulate himself is unfair, but this is something I'm going to be dealing with in 2 days' time. I'm going to be debating him and this is going to be put to him. So he's going to have a chance to defend himself, because I'm sure you as university students, people who are rational, people who have, you know, this thirst for knowledge, this thirst for debating, this thirst for argumentation and going back and forth and, you know, the Socratic method and whatnot. It's not nice that, you know, I'm taking down someone, but he's not here to defend himself. But I'm doing that because he didn't turn up. So, you know, I don't really have any other ways of putting it. I would rather put it to you guys, and then I'm going to put it to him on Saturday, and then he can defend himself and you can see if his defense actually makes any sense. Now, some of the things he's going to be saying here make no sense. They actually make zero sense, right? So he says, neo-Darwinism came about in the 1920s. Now, remember something. Somebody pointed out that they came to the debate because they saw the video. Who was it? That was you, right? So you said you saw the video, right? So this is the video in which he basically is debunking myself and Muhammad Ali. And in this video, he's basically saying these statements. So I'm going to read these out, and then we're going to test them according to the facts, whether these things actually hold any water. So he says, neo-Darwinism came about in the 1920s, okay? That's a very explicit statement, and that's a clear statement, so we're going to test that. The second statement, modern synthesis came 70 years later, which would make it 1990s. And he also objected to using these terms interchangeably. Now, as you've already seen, these terms are used interchangeably because the modern synthesis developed from neo-Darwinism, and neo-Darwinism means post-Darwinism. So there's no problem there. But let's just test the first two and see where we get to. So neo-Darwinism came about in the 1920s. So there's a bit of a problem with this, right? There's quite a issue here. The issue is that the founders of neo-Darwinism were dead by 1920s. So that's a bit of a problem to try and explain. How did this upgrade come about when the founders were dead? So August Weismann is one of the founders of neo-Darwinism, and so is Alfred Russel Wallace, who was one of the co-discoverers alongside Darwin of the theory of natural selection. So what do we know from these two individuals? What we know is that they defined neo-Darwinism. They are the founders of neo-Darwinism. They were dead by the 1920s. One of them passed away in 1914. The other one passed away in 1913. So what on earth was going on between Darwin's death and 1920s? That, you know, is something that Farina has to explain. He has to explain, okay, so what on earth was going on? What was happening in that period? That clearly shows he doesn't know what he's talking about. Because He's not aware of the discussions. He's not aware of clearly Wallace and Wiseman, who are super important in evolutionary history. These are giants in the history. These are not, some footnotes. These are really the pioneers of neo-Darwinism. And it's quite bizarre. It's quite bizarre for someone to make that claim, but it's also bizarre from the perspective that it's well known. You will find the word neo-Darwinism within the scientific literature quite early on. In fact, the earliest documented usage of neo-Darwinism is actually 1895. This is by George Romanes, and this is in a letter to Nature. Nature is a prestigious scientific journal. So what we have here is we have clear evidence that neo-Darwinism obviously doesn't go back to the 1920s. Now what Dennis Noble basically says about this is neo-Darwinism was first introduced as a term by that's actually a spelling mistake, so I'm going to have to sort that out, by George Romanes in a letter to Nature in 1895, but the roots go back to August Wiseman in around 1870. So this is not just me making these claims. This is Dennis Noble, who's an Oxford professor, and this is a Cambridge University publication. The history of neo-Darwinism is quite clear. So what we know is that the roots go back to 1870. So Farina is way off the mark here. The second thing that he said is the modern synthesis came 70 years later. And that would basically mean 1990, so 1920s plus 70, 1990s. The problem with this, again, is Julian Huxley, the one who actually wrote the Evolution, the Modern Synthesis, a book published in 1942. One of the founders of the modern synthesis was, again, you guessed it, he was dead by 1990. So again, a completely nonsensical claim, something that makes zero sense, right? So Julian Huxley is somebody who would have played a pivotal role, not just a role to do with on the side, trimming the hedges. We're talking about the pivotal role in the modern synthesis alongside George Maynard Smith and others. And what we know is that his ideas were prevalent all over the world. He is a really famous biologist. So how could Farina claim expertise in the area, make a video trying to debunk someone else when he doesn't understand when the modern synthesis came? And what does that go to show you about what he knows about the key figures, about the scientific papers, about the arguments, about the counter-arguments, about the narratives, about the refinements? If a person doesn't understand the most basic things, right? How do you expect them to understand any of this? And what makes this more hilarious is actually that in 1983, so this, he thinks the modern synthesis came about like in 1990s, right? We have a firm challenge, direct challenge by Barbara McClintock to one of the foundational assumptions of the modern synthesis, which she won the Nobel Prize for in 1983. So 1990s was not the origin of the modern synthesis. The modern synthesis came about much earlier, and in fact, by 1990s, one of the foundational assumptions had already been challenged. Now again, I'm going back to Dennis Noble here and what he says in his book, Dance to the Tune of Life. So he argues that neo-Darwinism developed into the modern synthesis, which is the standard view. There's nothing off about this in terms of what other academics are saying. The term neo-Darwinism was originally used by Romanes in 1896 to describe Wiseman and Wallace's version of Darwinism, which excluded the inheritance of acquired characters. It is now commonly used to describe the modern synthesis version of Darwinism, a wide-ranging consensus about the nature and dynamics of evolutionary change that emerged amongst biologists between the 1920s and 1950s, and was based on neo-Darwinian assumptions, including gradualism and population genetics based on the assumption that heritable variations are random, meaning functionally blind. That's quite a mouthful, but you get some key takeaways there. One of the takeaways that you get is obviously that modern synthesis developed from neo-Darwinism, but it still held on to neo-Darwinian assumptions. It's still called neo-Darwinism, and these terms are used interchangeably. And it was between the 1920s and 50s that you actually had the reconciliation of neo-Darwinism with Mendelian genetics. So all of this stuff is well known. All of this stuff is well understood. And he's completely off with those remarks. So remember, the entire idea of his video was, I'm here to show that these guys are using terms they don't understand. And what does he go on to do? He goes on to make some wild claims which just do not match history. He's just arguing with science and arguing with history here, which is it's going to be, look, I don't like to, people came here and they're just watching me challenging him, and he's not here to defend himself, but he'll have a chance in 2 days' time. Okay, so neo-Darwinism came about in the 1920s, false. Modern synthesis came 70 years later, false. Objected to using these terms interchangeably. Like we saw, academics actually use them in that way. So let me just give you an example. An example is this. Imagine a history teacher that comes along and says, World War I took place in the 1960s. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in the same decade that Hitler was in the trenches, and the same decade that JFK was killed. And then that teacher goes on to say, let me give you my geopolitical analysis of what happened, which countries invaded who, why did they... You'd say, wait a minute. If you do not understand the basic history, how will you be able to tell us who the figures are, who the armies are, who the narratives are, what propaganda vehicles were being used and who was challenging them, what was the meta-narratives, what were the moral... You're in no position if you get something so basic wrong. So in his refutation video, I could tell this guy doesn't basically know what he's talking about. And the easiest way to actually show that is simply by looking at his statements and comparing them to the statements of people in the field like the Oxford professor Dennis Noble. Now here's another claim that he made, and this is something I'm really going to enjoy on Saturday, inshallah, to put to him, which is this. You have Richard Dawkins and you have Dennis Noble having this grand debate about neo-Darwinism. They both define neo-Darwinism in the way that I explained. They both agree that the modern synthesis developed from neo-Darwinism. They both agree about the history. They both agree about, there's no difference in them when it comes to Wiseman, Wallace, Huxley. They understand these things. They're having this lively debate, and it's a really interesting debate, which took place 3 years ago, but it's gone back much further than that. So in this debate, where does Farina stake his flag? Which camp is he in? Well, I just want to put a statement to you. In his video, he said Dennis Noble is a complete clown. Okay? Now, that's rich. That's a really interesting way of putting it. So someone with no PhD, with no peer-reviewed papers, who's not an academic, who barely qualifies to be a supply teacher, and no disrespect to any supply teachers or potential supply teachers here, someone with no credentials is calling one of the top biologists in the world a complete clown. So this is one of the things I'm going to challenge him on Saturday. Because, as I showed you guys, he gets the history completely wrong. He claims neo-Darwinism came about in the 1920s. It didn't. He claims a modern synthesis came 70 years later. It didn't. He says you can't use these terms interchangeably. You can. I've shown that neo-Darwinism goes back to the 1890s. The roots are the 1870s. Modern synthesis came together in the 1920s to 1950s, not the 1990s. So much nonsense, but it's like layers upon layers of nonsense. But the way that he puts the cherry on top of the cake of nonsense is by making a statement like Dennis Noble is a complete clown. I want to take him to task for that, because I very much doubt he'll be able to provide any evidence that Dennis Noble is a complete clown. Now, say he provides some reasons for why Dennis Noble may be wrong on a certain issue. That's possible. That's probable. I doubt it because I very much doubt he even understands what Dennis Noble is actually saying. I doubt that. What I also doubt is that he understands the implications of calling someone like Dennis Noble a clown. I just want you to think of a few things. Number one, he's an Oxford professor, and he is somebody who has been a professor for decades. What does that go to show you about Oxford University? You know, there's that Turkish proverb that when a clown walks into a palace, he doesn't become the king, the palace becomes into a circus. What does it go to show about Oxford University if they're going to have someone that he claims is a complete clown as a professor there for decades? He is a fellow of the Royal Society. Now, the Royal Society is the oldest and the most prestigious society in the world. It's in fact the society in which you have the dialogue between Descartes and Spinoza. It's the society that you can find it going back as far as the 17th century. It's the society where in 1858, Darwin came to the society to propose his theory. In that very society, the oldest and the most prestigious society in the world, he is a royal fellow of that. And in fact, he set up a landmark meeting in 2016. And that, again, meeting that had between neo-Darwinists and third-way evolutionists, or whatever you want to call them, this is again something which goes to show the prestigious nature of the man, that he's able to set up a meeting like this at the Royal Society. Okay, he's also a pioneer of systems biology. His model, the Nobel model of 1962, this was the first mathematical model showing the activity, the function of cardiac cells and the pacemaker rhythm. This is novel stuff. This is really interesting stuff. Today, he's working right at the edge of cancer research. He's working right at the cutting edge. So here's a man who has facilitated a lot of good things for humanity in terms of the heart, in terms of cancer, in terms of knowledge, in terms of systems biology, served academia. In fact, one of the things I found that was interesting about him is he was actually the doctoral examiner of Richard Dawkins. So Richard Dawkins, in 1966, he got his doctorate and he was the actual examiner. So if Dennis Noble is a complete clown, then what does that go to show you about Dawkins? What does it go to show you about Cambridge University, which publishes his work? The Linnaean Society, which publishes his work. Nature, which publishes his work. Like, if you think about what Farina is saying, it's very hard. It's very hard, if we take him seriously, to take anybody else seriously after that point. Because how much higher do you need to go in academia? Now, like I said, he's no way is he going to be able to justify this statement. So he's actually going to be in a very tough position in the debate. Because in the debate, he's going to have two choices. And I don't like giving problems to people. I like giving them dilemmas, which are two problems, which is between a rock and a hard place. A dilemma is very clear in this case. If he doesn't attack Dennis Noble, if he doesn't try and justify Dennis Noble is a complete clown, then he will be written off as a coward. Because he said it in the video, he said it clearly, he said it more than once. So people will not take him seriously out of pure cowardice. However, the other horn of this dilemma is he attacks him. He attacks Dennis Noble. And he says, he's wrong because of X, Y, Z. Well, in that case, he's going to have to challenge someone who Richard Dawkins couldn't challenge. He's going to have to challenge someone who in academia is respected. What argument is Farina going to come up with that Dawkins couldn't come up with? What argument is Farina going to come up with which other academics have not been able to come up with? And even if he comes up with, okay, maybe Dennis Noble got this wrong or that wrong, that in no way, shape or form justifies calling him a clown, a complete clown. Now, there's no way Farina is going to be able to muster any sort of robust challenge to Noble's ideas. simply because he doesn't understand them. And even if he understood them, he wouldn't be able to challenge them. Because if he was able to challenge them, he'd be writing peer-reviewed papers, not making YouTube videos for teenagers, right? So what we have here is a dilemma. And the dilemma is very clear. He doesn't attack Dennis Noble. He's called a clown. He's called a coward for not attacking him because he called him a clown and now he's not justifying it. Or he attacks him and fails and looks incompetent. So this two-horned dilemma is something I'm going to put to him, inshallah, on Saturday, and we'll see what he does, because the facts are very clear. The facts are he is in a very difficult position, and I very much doubt he'll be able to justify his statements. Okay, so there's 4 main pillars of neo-Darwinism. There's 4 main pillars of neo-Darwinism which Dennis Noble challenges. And like I mentioned, when I say neo-Darwinism, I am also referring to the modern synthesis because they're used interchangeably. The central dogma, the Weismann barrier, the passive vehicle pillar, and randomness. These are, according to Dennis Noble, 4 foundational assumptions of neo-Darwinism, and he believes they are wrong. Okay, so I'm going to show they are wrong by giving you a few examples. And these are examples which actually came up in the debate between Richard Dawkins and Dennis Noble. Now, one of the things that Richard Dawkins said to Dennis Noble during the debate is, Dennis, if we could take your genome and we could carve it in granite, and then after 10,000 years, we're to take the A, T, C, and G, we're to take those codons, we're to put them into a sequencing machine, we could make a replica of you. This is neo-Darwinism. This is the idea genes created us mind and body. This is one-way causation. This is the central dogma. It's very clear. Now, Noble responded to Dawkins, you won't be able to do that. And Dawkins is a bit surprised. He's like, why not? And he says, you need an egg. You need an egg cell. Now, it seems like a very simple point, but I'm really going to break it down. And this is something which Dennis Noble has explained in length, and he's gone into a lot of details. I'm going to keep it quite broad, and we can get into the details in the Q&A if you wish. The first point is, DNA does not self-replicate. Dawkins calls DNA replicators. One of the things that Dennis Noble argues is that the egg cell, the membrane of the egg cell, has the conditional logic of life. So the genome you can think of like a template, and the on-off switches, the conditional logic, if this, then that, or something else. That conditional logic is actually in the cell membrane. And the genome doesn't actually code for that membrane. All of that machinery is inherited. So you have inheritance beyond the genome. Now, in the discussion, you'll see that Dawkins didn't actually have a response to Noble on that point. And Noble highlights also, and this is something he did in the post-debate interviews when he's breaking down his ideas in more detail, that where is Richard Dawkins going to get the egg cell from his mother in the 1930s? Because that's when Dennis Noble was born. Why did he make that statement? The reason he made that statement is because Dennis Noble has shown, and this is not him doing the experiments, him referring to the people who've done the experiments, that you have epigenetic marking of the genome, and that epigenetic marking you will not get purely by looking at the sequence. It's something that you inherit. You need the egg cell. You need that entire system to basically work. So what we have here is something very clear, that you can't just take someone's DNA, leave it in a petri dish for 10,000 years, and then do some you do some, what's it called? It does some self-replication. No, you actually need the egg cell. You actually need the conditional logic of life. You also, and Dennis Noble is quite adamant on this point, you need the proofreading system, because whenever you have replication, you have a huge number of errors, 1 in 10 to the power of 4. which if you look at the 3 billion base pairs, it becomes so astronomical in terms of the mistakes, it will destroy the organism. So you need the cell in order to do the proofreading system, and the proofreading system takes the mistakes from 1 in 10 to the 4 to 1 in 10 to the 10. I remember you were saying earlier you're studying mathematics here, right? So you can visualize the difference between having mistakes 1 in 10 to the power of 4 and 1 in 10 to the power of 10. So I can see you nodding. So you understand that's a huge difference. So that proofreading that happens, that reduces the mistakes, is something that you don't get from the genome itself. And Dennis Noble, again, he's published something with Nature. Nature is the oldest and the most prestigious scientific journal in the world. I can see you nodding, so you've heard of Nature as well, right? A lot of people don't understand. When we're saying Nature, we're saying Royal Society. These are ancient, not ancient, these are old institutions which should be respected. So one of the things that he wrote, and this is back last year, it's time to admit that genes are not the blueprint of life. So again, genes created mind and body, the selfish gene idea, right? Genes being self-replicators. Okay, so we've covered the example of genes not being a blueprint. The other example is somatic hypermutation. Now remember the central dogma. The central dogma is the idea DNA to RNA to proteins. So DNA transcribes to RNA, translates to proteins. There's one-way causation, right? What Dennis Noble points out is we have somatic hypermutation. So what we basically have is we have the cell or group of cells or the organism, or whichever way you want to break it down to, that environmental stress, that environmental input, it causes a reaction in which you have communication from the cell membrane, the surface of the cell, all the way to the nucleus, and the part of the genome which is needed to create the antibodies, the ability, the randomness at that point to increase that so that we have much more varieties which can then be selected, okay? Now, that selection, that production, that randomness is something which is used by the organism to fight off diseases. So the second example is somatic hypermutation. So in a nutshell, what is somatic hypermutation? It challenges the central dogma. So somatic hypermutation is where you have the external stress causing the genome to actually mutate faster in certain parts while other parts are held together. Think of it like a slot machine. You know, we obviously don't play those gambling games, but you know, you got the lemon, then you got the cherry or whatever. So you hold two of them in place, you get the third one. So you have that randomness being increased. And how is that increased? This is really interesting. Remember the proofreading thing I just mentioned? The proofreading mechanism is actually down-regulated to increase randomness. It's really phenomenal. So that's how you get somatic hypermutation. Another example is transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. So what this is in a nutshell is we have epigenetics going on, we have the environment causing the organism to actually inherit epigenetic markers. These epigenetic markers are important in terms of how to adapt to the environment. So a very simple example of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance is the work of Conrad Waddington. He wrote a really interesting book in 1957 called Strategy of the Genes. Now, what he basically shows in fruit flies is he applies different types of selective pressures on them, and that causes this epigenetic process to be activated. And what that means is certain genes are switched on and certain are not. Think of it in this very simple way. Think of it like your genome being a library of books, okay? Now, those library of books are not all read. They're not all read. In the environment, there is a certain stress, and the stress from the work he was doing. Maybe he starved the fruit flies, maybe applied some heat, shock, whatever it is. What would happen is that environmental stress would then be communicated straight through to the genome. And that communication would mark the genome. So what that would basically mean is this. That would mean if your genome is a series of books, certain books would be read, other books would be switched off. Okay? So this epigenetic marking is something very clear. And how does it happen? It happens through something known as extracellular vesicles. Now, these were discovered later, but we observed the phenomena, we discovered the vesicles later. Now, what's so interesting about this is that this epigenetic marking, if the environment remains the same, if the epigenetic markings are activated again and again, they become genetically assimilated in the genome, meaning you have genetic change. And this happens in as little as 14 generations. So the work of Conrad Waddington again challenges many of the assumptions of the modern synthesis. Okay, another really interesting thing is genome reorganization. So remember I mentioned Barbara McClintock, the work that she did, and she discovered a process which challenged one of the assumptions of neo-Darwinism, the modern synthesis, which made her win the Nobel Prize in 1983. Now, genome reorganization is something that she observed, and it's so interesting as a process. What she observed is that you had these mobile genetic elements. When environmental stress was applied to the organism, you had these mobile genetic elements that moved around. They moved around, and that moving around in the genome is something which activated adaptive responses to what was happening outside. Now, this amazing process, which totally challenges the central dogma, totally challenges the Weismann barrier as well, because if you keep applying the stresses again and again and again and again, it can become genetically assimilated, as I pointed out, Conrad Waddington showed, although his work came after hers. All of this, again, challenges neo-Darwinism, challenges the modern synthesis. Okay, so going back to the debate between Dennis Noble and Richard Dawkins, a lot of these things were discussed. A lot of these things were discussed, and Dawkins tried his best to try and address Noble in terms of the evidences that he was bringing from Waddington, from Barbara McClintock, the proofreading. You know, he's obviously someone that's not done all the studies here, but he's referring to people like James Shapiro and others. Dawkins had no response. Now, if Dawkins did not have a response at that point, and nor has anybody else, then how is Farina, with no PhD, no peer-reviewed papers, who's called him a complete clown, how is he going to be able to justify the statements that he's actually made? And how is he going to justify that he's actually wrong, let alone if he's a clown or not? Because that's a different matter, right? So in the debate, you will see he will have no answer to this. In fact, I'm assuming, remember I said the dilemma? The dilemma between being a coward and being incompetent? He's going to go with being a coward. He's not going to show he's incompetent, because to show he's incompetent, he has to show some level of competence. That's another dilemma within a dilemma, because he has to show he can understand something, then try and challenge it, which I very much doubt he's going to be able to do, because if he was aware of Dennis Noble and the work that he's done and was aware of his contributions and actually understood them, there's no way he would say that he's wrong, let alone say that he is a complete clown. And the third way of evolution is a project which Dennis Noble, James Shapiro, and others have put together, which is challenging neo-Darwinism. You can check it out yourself. Some very interesting stuff about that you'll find online. This is my last slide, because my presentation today was basically the opening that I have on Saturday, inshallah, with Dave Farina. What you'll find in Understanding Living Systems is that's the latest book with Dennis Noble and Ray Noble, which is his brother. They explain why the modern synthesis, why neo-Darwinism is wrong. They go over the 4 pillars. Remember what I said, the Weismann barrier, central dogma, genes being replicators and the vehicle being a passive organism. And the last one was randomness, right? That you don't have randomness, you have massive you have massive rearrangements of the genome. You actually have, in fact, there's something really interesting that Dennis Noble says, which is, if it was just random small mutations like point mutations or duplications, insertions, inversions, whatever it is, there's not enough time in the universe for life to actually evolve. So genome reorganization is the way it happened. So it wasn't this way. The causation wasn't from DNA to RNA to proteins. You actually had the environment rearranging genomes. And in fact, he referred to a paper in 2001 during his debate with Richard Dawkins, and that's something that he couldn't actually respond to. So myself and the biologist Salman Butt, we have actually published a book called The Death of Neo-Darwinism. The Death of Neo-Darwinism, the title came from Dennis Noble saying, Neo-Darwinism is dead, right? So that is where that's from. And Richard Dawkins actually wrote a book a few months ago called The Genetic Book of the Dead. And in this book, he is basically trying to challenge what happened in the debate between him and Dennis Noble in 2022. So 2 years later, he writes a book. However, that book's also been addressed in our book, The Death of Neo-Darwinism. And Scott Turner, he's an evolutionary biologist. He's written a response to the Genetic Book of the Dead. And that's something I'm going to be covering on my channel, inshallah, in the coming weeks. So just to summarize where we are. This was supposed to be a debate between me and Farina. He's supposed to be here. He's not here. He made certain claims which are so absurd that no one should take him seriously. Neo-Darwinism came about in the 1920s. We know it didn't. We know it came about much earlier. The modern synthesis came 70 years later, 1990s. No, it didn't. What does that go to show you? It goes to show you he is as qualified to speak about evolutionary biology when it comes to the important discussions that we're having as a history teacher who claims that World War I took place in the 1960s. So, in other words, he's not qualified at all. Then he goes on further to show his incompetence by putting a cherry on top of the cake and saying that Dennis Noble is a complete clown. And like I showed, Dennis Noble is far from being a complete clown. He is a bona fide academic, one of the top evolutionary biologists in the world, and I went over all of his credentials, and Farina obviously is not qualified in any capacity to be even criticizing him or be on the same platform as him. And likewise, we went through the detailed molecular biology when it comes to Dennis Noble and his arguments against Neo-Darwinism, and I gave the dilemma for Farina, which I'm going to give him on Saturday. And that dilemma is very clear. He either attacks Dennis Noble and he looks incompetent, or he refuses to attack him and looks like a coward. Now, I look forward to the debate on Saturday, and I recommend you watch it as well. And maybe in the future, the next time he comes to the UK, we can actually set up something in person, because he didn't actually turn up. So again, thank you to the Islamic Society and the Student Union for facilitating this talk, and I look forward to your questions. Jazakallah khair. I know that was very detailed and heavy, and who comes here from a biology background? A-level? Okay, good.
Okay, question. Why is it that nowadays we find, especially like with me, with my siblings as well, we find in schools, it's this idea of evolution and Darwinism it's almost been pushed towards them, but alhamdulillah they have the Islamic education like to help them in a sense. But is there a way that we as a community can collectively almost challenge this and almost find an alternative in terms of what they teach them and what they almost enforce or indoctrinate them with almost?
I think what it is we have to educate ourselves in terms of what this theory is, because in the past, I think it was quite easy to simply say, oh, don't worry about it, that kind of thing, right? But now we have to do things like this. You have to go into the science, go into the philosophy, go into the discussions, go into the rights and wrongs and that kind of thing. We have to get into this type of thing. Now, your question, Luqman, was really interesting, which is why are they doing it? Is they doing it because neo-Darwinism is used as an argument for atheism? That's the real issue. At rock bottom, they want to push atheism. So that's why they're pushing it.
Why are so many so-called like scientists, right? They're so like adamant that, or not they're adamant that they don't want to see any new changes to neo-Darwinism. Like they don't want people to question it. Because I remember seeing a clip of Dennis Noble. He mentioned how he set up like a meeting in 2016 or something along those lines, and there were so many people that protested it. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah.
So what's the cause? Like, why the protests? Why?
That's a really good question. So you're referring to New Trends in Evolutionary Biology, a meeting that Dennis Noble set up, and this was basically a meeting at the Royal Society. The Royal Society is the first place where Darwin proposed his idea in 1858. Now, Dennis Noble clearly was being challenged, and that event nearly got cancelled. However, he kept it as a free platform for anyone to come and espouse their views. It wasn't just that the third way of evolution guys were going to challenge neo-Darwinism. No, the neo-Darwinists can come and they can actually explain their perspective as well. But I think there was a type of dogmatism. There was a type of reductive commitments which were stopping people from going into this direction. And I think the reason is because they don't want to say that they were wrong for decades. Because what that will do is that will bring in the creationists and bring in the intelligent design proponents, and it'll bring in theists and bring in people saying, hey, you guys can be wrong. So I think that was one of the main causes. Although Dennis Noble himself, he doesn't believe in God. He doesn't believe in intelligent design, creationism, nor does James Shapiro, nor does Scott Turner in terms of their science. They keep away from all of this. Yet, that was a meeting in which you saw that even though within that institution you have the secular biologists coming together, they still could not allow something that could potentially be used by people who believe in God. Yeah, and Dennis Noble obviously thinks that's complete nonsense. He thinks we should do science the way it's done, whether the conclusions lead this way or that way, philosophically, that's irrelevant. Yeah. I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think it's a good way of putting it.
And you mentioned that Dennis Noble and alongside someone else is coming up with a new theory. Can you give a brief explanation of what that is? The third way, I think, was something like that.
Yeah. Basically, what is his perspective? In a nutshell, his perspective is Darwinists, neo-Darwinists are saying there's a blind watchmaker. All you have is randomness plus natural selection. Okay? Dennis Noble is saying, no, there is randomness, but that randomness is used by the organism for its own needs. There is a clear communication between the outside world and the inside world, and that dynamic nature means that the watchmaker's not blind, the watchmaker's one-eyed, according to him. So causality for Noble is not just that the genes are causal. And in the debate you see between Richard Dawkins and Dennis Noble that Dennis Noble is saying that genes are not causal, and Richard Dawkins is saying they are causal. And what we mean by causal here, as in they are the efficient cause, they are the main cause, they are the primary cause, because according to Noble, there's no privileged level of causation. Now, he doesn't deny they are causal from a template perspective. And this is where he brings in the 4 types of causes that Aristotle came up with. So look at this, for example, podium, right? This podium has 4 causes, according to Aristotle. There is the efficient cause, which is the carpenter. So I would be the efficient cause. There is the material that it's made of. So that's the material cause. There is the form of the table, the shape that makes it into a table and not a chair. And that's the formal cause. And there is the final cause. Why is this table here? So I can deliver a lecture or do cooking or whatever, right? So according to those categories, Noble argues that genes are causes from a template perspective. They are not efficient causes. They're not active causes in the way that they created us mind and body. Now, Richard Dawkins doesn't seem to understand the distinctions of causality and doesn't seem to understand, or doesn't even follow up with this conversation. And his whole idea of there being no level of privileged causation, He doesn't really understand that. Now, what you find in the debate is they don't get into these points in any detailed way. However, later on, Dennis Noble explains why Dawkins didn't understand his points, or why Dawkins was just way off the mark when it came to this point or that point. Now, what is his alternative? His alternative is evolution can be directional. Life has purpose, it has agency, and it's not just natural selection plus randomness. It is, to a great extent, it is actually directional. It's not blind. And that is a total paradigm shift, right? Now, he puts together 10 principles of systems biology. And these principles include some of the things that we mentioned, there being not one-way causation. You can have causation in multiple directions. You can't make a separation between the gene and the vehicle, right? Because they're linked. And then in his book as well, he goes over the definition of a gene and how it's changed and how Richard Dawkins uses it in a way that's very confusing and self-serving. So it is a total paradigm shift. It is a total paradigm shift. And with these guys, they're quite humble. They're not making claims beyond the evidence. They're still saying there's a lot we don't know. There's processes that we previously thought were impossible. Watch some of the interviews I've done with James Shapiro, who's another third-way evolutionist. He's the direct student of Barbara McClintock, who won the Nobel Prize for her discovery of mobile genetic elements and their work in genome reorganization. Like all of these guys, they'll give you challenges, especially in terms of the 4 foundational pillars of neo-Darwinism, and their perspective at the moment, at best, is still not complete. It's still not complete. However, it does put to bed neo-Darwinism. They do say neo-Darwinism's dead, and I do think that's where the evidence is leading. Hope that answers the question.
Where is your current reading on the subject? Where do you focus on right now?
I focus on the theistic understanding when it comes to evolution. So where my primary focus is how does it reconcile? How do you reconcile the scientific data with the idea of God, right? Does it challenge God in the way that neo-Darwinists say that it does? I don't think it does. And a lot of other academics don't think it does. How does the whole story interact with other broader philosophical ideas? Purpose, meaning, value, morals, ethics, society, psychology. So the implications of neo-Darwinism, the implications of the third way. I'm very keen on, and this is what inshallah my PhD is on as well, developing some novel ideas when it comes to theistic evolutionary ideas. That's my main area of interest.